Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Stiefel Hall, Ernst C. Stiefel Hall, at Mannes School of Music of the College of Performing Arts at the New School. It used to just be Mannes, but it gets more complicated as the years go by. But if you haven't been at Mannes downtown yet, welcome. The exciting thing about West 13th Street is my teacher, Albert Valdez Blaine, other people's teacher, Albert Valdez Blaine, lived on this street for decades. And I, and some other people here, studied with him.
Also Rolando.
Was also nearby. Albert's apartment, where I got mugged in the elevator, was number 42 across the street. And then he moved to Montparnasse, the building just east of here. And so it was always fun coming from New Jersey when I was in high school for my guitar lessons in Greenwich Village. And now, some years later, 45 years later, the school is here, so I'm back in the neighborhood. So we're very pleased you're here. After the amazing presentation that I heard a preview of, there'll be an extremely short break, and then the guitar students, grads and undergrads of Mannes, are going to perform. They'll each play for about 6 to 10 minute range. And that'll be the festivities tonight. And meanwhile, John will announce our program for tonight. Thanks for coming.
I know some of you, I'm John Lehmann-Haupt. I am also on the board of the Guitar Society. And John Wilson is very sorry not to be here tonight. I know he really wanted to hear this presentation, but yet you have to be out of town. So I'm going to, just a couple of things, reminders. Tomorrow night, John and his wife Joya, you may know them either personally or know them as the Olsen Hikari Duo, are doing a launch concert for their new CD, which is called Eve's Diary. And it's tomorrow night, 7:30. It's at Symphony Space. And there are cards for that out on the music stand. If any of you can make it tomorrow, it would be great. The CD, I don't know if any of you have heard it yet, but it's a great selection of music. These are songs either written or arranged by a number of people, by David Leisner, by Frank Wallace, Joao Luis of the Brazil Guitar Duo, and also Clarice Assad, yet another of the famous Assad clan. So I just want to, a couple of other things. This is our last event of the year, of 2018, and we're just delighted to be able to do it in this space. I'll just mention that the first event of 2019 will be our next member meeting, which will be January 10th, and that's going to be Mark Del Priora, and he's going to be giving a concise view of the New York classical guitar scene through the 1950s and early 1960s. Another, I think, really interesting topic for all of us, and perhaps even more so for some of us who we're not children anymore, not so young anymore. And our concert, our first concert of the year will be a great one. It's going to be January 18th. This is going to be Guitar Plus, which is sort of becoming an annual event where David Leisner comes with a group of his friends and does a marvelous performance. And this is going to be kind of a celebration of his 65th birthday. He's going to have an all-star cast of other guitarists and singers performing his music. So now moving to tonight's program, which is something I've really been looking forward to and I'm very interested in. I'd like to introduce Kevin Sherwin. And the program, as you know, as you can see it, it's right here, it's classical guitar on early sound recordings. And Kevin is a graduate of Yale. He also studied with Tali Roth at Juilliard, and some of you may have been to the last meeting where Tali told her story, which is a beautiful story. And Kevin performs widely. He's done extensive research in the history of performance practice, and he currently serves as the Associate Artistic Director of the Period Instrument Ensemble, the American Baroque Orchestra. And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce and welcome Kevin Sherwin.
Thank you all so much for coming out this evening. I'm really quite excited to share with you research that's really important to my work as a musician, as a performer, and I just personally find very fascinating. For years, listening to different recordings and then slowly beginning to try and figure out what these performers we're doing. I think it's a very exciting time for performers today. There's so many different possibilities. It seems like every day there's a new opportunity for collaboration or different influences. And in looking at the present and the future of the guitar world, it's also a nice time to see what people did about 100 years ago and kind of take a step back. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, classical guitarists exhibited distinctive playing styles and approaches to musical expression. The rich tradition of these musicians was captured through early sound recordings that date back to the first decade of the 1900s. These often rare recordings can serve as audio treatises of past styles of guitar performance, conveying common and contrasting approaches to expressive devices, including tempo rubato, portamento, articulation, and rhythmic variation, to name a few. By immersing the ear in the numerous classical guitar recordings of the early 20th century, there evolves an ability to recognize and examine these stylistic features as they pertain to individual performers and also trends across performers. We can also begin to understand the musical reasoning behind these choices, especially as it pertains to the specific repertoire and genres being performed. Furthermore, given that many of the guitarists on early recordings were colleagues, collaborators, or students of the composers whose repertoire they were performing, these early recordings are artifacts of an oral transmission that incorporates an interpretive nuance particularly relevant to music of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Such intricacies of this oral transmission were primarily presented to the public through performance rather than explicit written documentation. There's only so much that could be written down in a book. In this way, the audio recordings of these guitarists serve as an invaluable source to the ears of performers, music students, pedagogues, and scholars alike, enabling us to objectively evaluate the stylistic actualizations and conventions of these guitarists. The earliest known classical guitar recordings appeared on cylinders, as above, which were concurrent with flat 78 RPM discs. But by the 1910s and 20s, 7 to 10 inch 78 RPM discs predominated, offering better consistency in terms of audio fidelity. From the 1910s to the 1940s, recording technology developed from an acoustical or mechanical process to an electrical process, and the assistance of electricity further improved the fidelity of the audio product. Nevertheless, it's important to recognize that all of these recordings convey far less of a realistic sound than modern listeners are used to. However, they still manage to get across the important aspects in terms of performance practice, the detailed sounds of articulation, portamento, and phrasing, and in a manner that conveys the unique styles of the period and allows for our own examination and understanding. It's also well to note that pitch was not standardized for musicians. Today we have A equals 440 or even 441 or 442, but that was not as standardized back then. The A that they used in the early 20th century could be lower. There are stories of it being higher occasionally, but it's important to note that it wasn't one pitch. And this is especially important in terms of digitization. All the recordings I'll be playing for you are digitized from original 78 sources. And in terms of considering the playback speeds, you have to realize that it's not always at one standard A. As Mark Bailey, who is in the audience this evening, director of the Yale Collection of Historical Sound Recordings, where these recordings are from, points out, there are some myths about early recordings that potentially impede the development of an approach to understanding the heard playing styles. For instance, there's an impression that performers generally played, say, faster than they were used to in order to fit a section of music onto a side that could only record a few minutes of music. But through immersed listening, this contention overall proves to be false, since the majority of performers showed no signs of limiting their ritardandi or relaxation of tempo with regards to rubato. Rather, what performers would do to solve this problem is they'd make cuts in the actual music so that their rendition would fit onto a side appropriately. In a similar manner, some contend that instrumentalists and singers were afraid that they wouldn't be heard by the tone of the pre-electric era or the microphone of the electric era, so they overplayed or oversang. On the contrary, recording engineers actually had to pull away musicians, especially singers, from the fear that the sound wouldn't blast the mechanism. As well, written accounts do not reflect that musicians had these attitudes, and moreover, the listener frequently hears moments of soft and subtle playing or singing. It's not to say that these recordings that you'll hear tonight exactly replicate the way that music was played on all occasions. Rather, historical recordings can be approached with the perspective that they show an important way in which music was performed and heard with increasing popularity. Now, it's well to note that the recordings that were made, and made most often, were commercially successful. This was a commercial endeavor, creating recordings. So this is also a reflection of what audience taste was. Classical guitarists who flourished on recordings in the first half of the 20th century can trace their roots back to the 19th century. For instance, Emilio Pujol and Miguel Llobet both studied with Francisco Tárrega and left significant recording outputs. Furthermore, the Argentine guitarist Maria Luisa Anido, who recorded prolifically, studied with Llobet. As well, Pujol taught many students at the Lisbon Conservatory of Music and also wrote a widely distributed instruction manual, Guitar School, based on the principles of Francisco Tárrega. In addition, Louise Walker, a guitarist that we will hear later, studied with the German virtuoso Heinrich Albert, and here's a copy of the front of one of his method books. Albert was not only a guitarist, but also a violinist and a horn player. In the late 19th century, Albert played in orchestras under luminary conductors of the time, including Mahler, Arthur Nikic, Felix Weingartner, all of whom defined the orchestral playing styles of the day. Through Heinrich Albert's pupils, one can hear similar characteristics between guitarists and popular violinists, pianists, singers, and orchestras of the day. So in discussing the guitar world of the early 20th century, I'd also like to mention Andres Segovia, because he was a very influential figure. And he has many similarities to other guitarists of his era that you'll hear. As well, in many ways, Segovia marks a change in playing styles and approach to the guitar world that would influence the following generations, a study of which could take up an entire presentation of its own. As Segovia's playing styles, influence, and recordings have been well documented in various books, articles, and re-release projects, this presentation focuses on those guitarists of great renown who made invaluable contributions to the world of guitar performance. Tempo rubato, the expressive flexibility of pulse. One of the stylistic characteristics that is apparent in recordings of the early 20th century is the actualization of tempo fluctuation and flexibility. As guitarists today, we're quite comfortable with the idea that musical playing entails an artful and tasteful relationship with tempo rubato, which is simply understood as a departure from a steady metronomic pulse. As unaccompanied soloists, very often, we guitarists are afforded this freedom of expression without the rhythmic parameters of having to align with a supporting instrument, or in a section, such as in an orchestra. Nevertheless, in listening to historical recordings of the early 20th century, it's reasonable to say that performers' use of tempo rubato in the past was wider in scope, frequently permeating the fabric of an interpretation rather than serving as a kind of special moment or effect. In this way, for these historical artists, tempo rubato can be understood as an indispensable tool of musical expression that created a substantial degree of tempo elasticity. Consequently, the pulse is present and alive. It's very important the pulse is still very much there, yet highly responsive to the character and organic structures within the music. As tempo rubato was characteristic of interpretation at large in the early 20th century, I'd like to begin by playing a recording by the American pianist Stel Anderson, playing the Brahms Waltz in E major, Opus 39, number 2. The recording is likely from the year 1930. While there are no explicit tempo indications in the score, it's quite apparent that the pianist gets faster and slower as part of her sense of phrasing. If you'd like, feel free to tap along or conduct the recording on play. One may ask, is this kind of tempo flexibility simply the whim of the performer, or are there more specific reasons that guide such expression? Stell Anderson's flexibility of pulse is far from arbitrary, and actually I'll go back to the last slide to show the score. As just one example, she follows the hairpins in a characteristically 19th century manner as an indication not to get louder and softly exclusively, but as an indication to speed up and slow down. Such an interpretation of the hairpins, as discussed by scholars such as Clive Brown, was the way that Brahms not only intended his expressive indications to be actualized, but also the way that Brahms himself played these hairpins. The use of the pulse in this way served to heighten the high point and overall contour of the phrase as a musical unit for the audience's ear. So a very audience-centered approach. This kind of pulse flexibility based on the phrase was also heard in guitarists of the era. An excellent example is the circa 1930s recording of Albanese's famous Granada by the Argentine guitarist Maria Luisa Anido. In her interpretation, one can hear an extension of Stell Anderson's rubato. In the opening phrases, listen to how she speeds up into the center of the phrase, and slows down at the culmination of the phrase, quite dramatically by modern standards. So keep your eye on that top left line at the beginning of the recording. Expressive flexibility of pulse can also be actualized not necessarily by the phrase, but also from note to note, in which the performer creates emphasis through agogic accents, which can be described as a lengthening of an individual note in terms of time. As well, guitarists can be heard accelerating through small groups of notes to create an extra sense of momentum within a phrase. One example is the Uruguayan guitarist Julio Oyengaren, who displays these expressive devices in an arrangement of Schubert's Stenken D957, which is originally for voice and piano. In particular, Oyengaren lingers on downbeats and allows the pickup notes of each measure to rush forward with a lyrical sense of momentum, very much based on the actual text of the original voice and piano work. The score pictured on the slide, just to note, is in a different key than Oyengaren's arrangement. This is the original. In other instances, guitarists on early recordings execute certain rhythmic gestures with deliberate alterations, deliberate changes to what's written in the score, creating musical effects that provide a sense of heightened and particular expression. I'd like to play 3 recordings that use the practice of unequal notes, which in the French context is known as notes en égal, and can be understood as a swung 8-note rhythm. You'll see here on the left 2 approximations of notes en égal, depending on how the performer decides to execute it. Either you see straight 8 notes executed in a triplet fashion on the left, and then over to the right, straight 8 notes being executed with a dotted 8th and 16th pattern. This practice today is an integral part of 17th and 18th century performance practice, as it's well documented in famous treatises by the French keyboard player Georges Maffat and German flutist Johann Quantz, among many others. Actually, in a recent Scott Tennant recording, I was just listening to a podcast, he was talking about his use of en égal in some transcriptions of French lute works. So it's very common practice for Baroque music, and especially Baroque French music today. The repeated presence in early recordings, though, of this specific rhythmic alteration in 19th century repertoire suggests the possibility that this practice of en égal continued well past the 1700s, as it's currently understood. The first example is another recording of Julio Oyengaren of an arrangement of Brahms's waltz in A-flat major, opus 39, number 15 for piano. First, you'll hear a performance that adheres to the written score and rhythm by pianist Georgi Zifra, and then Oyengaren's recording. In the next recording, Spanish guitarist Vicente Gomez, who, fun fact, he had a radio program that followed Toscanini's very famous orchestral radio program. Vicente Gomez was the hour after. He was very famous as both a flamenco and classical guitarist, and also had his own nightclub. He was a very amazing public figure and classical guitarist.
Was that in New York City?
It was in New York City, yeah. And he, too, as you could imagine, with that kind of persona, uses notes en égal to create a kind of dancing-like lilt in his musical expression. Here's a fantastic example of the famous Adelita, which is subtitled as a mazurka, a Polish folk dance, important to note. And one can hear how Gomez's rhythmic alteration generates momentum into beat 2, where an accent's written, which conforms with the mazurka pattern. Throughout, Gomez's choice of tempo, rhythmic alteration, and general flexibility gives Adelita a distinctive grace and charm that is almost reminiscent of this traditional Polish folk dance.
With that almost turning it into a dotted rhythm on the first beat. And I never heard anyone else do that, but somewhere along the line I heard something, and you sort of alluded to this, but this has something to do with the actual dance, that there's actually a leap at some point in the dance. I don't know exactly how that works. But
So to explain that further, so the Polish mazurka dance, and Chopin wrote a lot of these, as an accent on the second figure. I wish I knew a mazurka dance so I could demonstrate, but it's probably something 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So there's a real accent, as opposed to the downbeat, which usually has the accent. And so you see, Tadego was quite aware of this. He writes an accent, and for the people who don't know, or just any player. And if you think about it, shortening the second note enables the phrasing into the second downbeat, so that the rhythmic alteration, the actual values of the notes is at play for the phrasing to work properly. And that's what Vicente Gomez really demonstrates. And you also see where it says un poco crescendo, he rushes through those notes fantastically. And you can see that's the repetition of the opening theme, so that there's a separation. So it's all related to the organic structure of the music in terms of laying out phrase by phrase.
That's also along the lines of what you were saying about the hairpins also being rhythmic indications for that.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's an intuitive aspect to it, because one way to create a crescendo is to make the sound louder. But another way to create a crescendo is to play faster so that there's more sound in that period of time. And so the kind of acceleration actually creates an excitement and a sense of a crescendo into the downbeat as well. And so this third example of Notes en égal is a performance by Miguel Llobet, which was from the 1920s, and it's of the famous Soar Etude in B minor. The recording was brought to light by the guitarist, lutenist, and radio broadcaster Robert Spencer in a radio program from the 1980s. This is how I came upon this specific recording. Llobet generally groups the eighth notes into long, short pairings, this kind of rhythmic alteration of first one long, second one short, which is particularly pronounced on beats 1 and 3, you'll hear. Overall, this creates a sense of spontaneity, swing, and rhythmic buoyancy. So rather than just being an etude, there's an actual sense of a vocal characteristic to the full texture. That recording to me has almost an effect of proclamation in a kind of B minor etude that can often come out as purely a lament. This one, the dotted rhythms give it a sense of vitality that adds a forthrightness to that lamentation. That's how I feel about that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I know this is sort of getting into the suppositional realm, but given that, okay, so this is basically the first generation of recording guitars. So what we can assume is that there's a sort of a line of oral transmission before that. Okay, so Sword dies like, what, 40 years before this guy's born or something like that. But can we make any guess about whether this was in fact in some way the grandson of how Sword might have played the piece from that point of view?
Yeah, well, that's the fascinating thing, that they're much closer to the original source than we are. And you look at what I mentioned in the beginning of the Enegal, that's an 18th century practice from the 1700s. So you have this sandwich of Enegal, if you will, and source somewhere in the middle. And that's to draw the conclusion that it seems like this could be an applicable practice for Sohr. In his Sohr's method book too, he doesn't refer to anything specific about notes in Enegal as a practice, but at that time, people would be very familiar with it all across Europe. So I think that would be a reason why he wouldn't have specifically mentioned it. So that's the extent of the supposition for me. Yeah. Does that make sense?
No, it does.
Yeah.
It's just, I sort of had this line of thought in a sort of a, maybe a little bit more far-flung way, but in sort of my own thought of wanting to defend Segovia's way of playing Bach, which I've always loved, but has been assailed, the last 50 years by a lot of people, so correct. But I always thought, wait a minute, these guys are in the line of transmission, they're actually closer to it. So even though there's, more than a century between the two of them, they're still...
Exactly. I think the most productive way of approaching the recordings is rather than trying to understand, is this exactly what the original source was, or is this exactly correct? Because there was no one way of performing, even during the period of Sohr. It's so interesting to think, how did Giuliani, play Aguada? They each had their own character and brought something different to it, and it's still a very authentic and engaging way of approaching a repertoire. I think the most productive way of thinking is, where's the performance practice coming from? And so even with Segovia playing Bach transcriptions, which is a romantic trend, same with Pablo Casals, it's more productive to think, where's that performance practice coming from? Because I think something that might be missing is what's the Baroque in the way Segovia is doing it. And so if you totally exit out, then you miss, oh, well, actually, that was a Baroque performance practice too. So that's how I try and approach it. And I think it's so fascinating. That's what Robert Spencer in the radio broadcast mentioned about the Engel. He pointed out this and said, well, it could link back to the 19th century. The next expressive element is portamento. I like to call it a melodic connector. Portamento, also referred to as a slide or arrastre or glissando. There's some subtle differences in many different definitions, but they all refer to this sliding of the pitch in between two pitches. Served a significant role in melodic expression for guitarists of the early 20th century. As common in guitar practice today, portamento acts as an ornamental device and is generally reserved for special moments in the melody, or when a slide is explicitly marked in the score. And as guitarists, we have quite a bit of that in much Spanish repertoire and otherwise. But by contrast, early recordings of classical guitarists, along with early recordings of string players, singers, and even orchestras and choirs, reveal that portamento served as a melodic connector, heightening the feeling of legato in the phrase by bridging the gap between pitches. And if you understand portamento as linked with legato, it becomes very interesting to listen to phrasing that way. In the following recording by violinist Leopold Auer, pictured above, who premiered Tchaikovsky's violin concerto, he plays Tchaikovsky's Melodie. In this recording, the listener can hear how portamento is not executed as a subtle expressive device, but rather as a stylized component that actively participates in shaping the melodic phrase. There's really an endless variety of early recordings, and there were some pieces that were very, very famous and recorded dozens and dozens of times. And these are particularly fun in terms of research, to have 40 different recordings of one piece, and just to see the distinct approaches that different players use. Overall, these expressive devices aren't limitations, but they're actually the kind of colors that performers can use to be individual. And the portamento to our ears today, it's so stylized. It's a different sound world. And there are some recordings that are even more extreme in terms of their use of portamento that are particularly delightful, especially to show people who've never heard early recordings. It's like, oh my goodness, they did some of those as well. And I'd say that's somewhere in between. One can observe in the guitar method books of the early and mid-20th century a dedicated approach and training of portamento that is less in practice today in various instruction manuals. And I really want to see, is this something that they talk about, or is this something that was common practice? And it's actually something that the teachers really focused on training, because it's not something that would come to the technique in terms of second nature. Volumes by Heinrich Albert, Julio Sagreras, and Emilio Pujol show portamenti marked explicitly into the exercises with the intention of showing the student how and where the technique should be applied. In consequence, the student would understand where to apply portamento without actually needing to see it in the score. Strikingly, in Albert's method, where this is from, we see indications for portamento that go across rests. And you can see, where's that one?
First line.
First line, thank you. Oh, perfect. Yes, that goes across a rest. So you think, it's supposed to stop the sound. No, that's just a gestural indication that D is actually supposed to be held over the E and slide into the C. And we can talk about what the difference between notating a tie there and notating a rest could mean in terms of other expressive factors. So we also see a double portamento, I like this one, right here in thirds, where in a musical context today, we probably wouldn't be expected to even add a slide in one of these voices. And say, oh, not in thirds, you have to hear thirds. Here, actually slide into both of these. And in the German text, this is not just a fingering mechanism. This actually means to slide the sound. Another telling example is in Pujol's guitar school based on the principles of Francisco Tárrega, where we see several pages of exercises, one page after the other, devoted to training each individual finger to apply portamento with a variety of shifting patterns. Here you can see on page 13, 14 you get some more, and then you get a whole other set of portamento exercises. All these different chromatic exercises to train a very individual portamento so that the student would be able to apply it naturally and intuitively. In early recordings, one can hear portamento as an expressive device that cooperates with the performer's tempo rubato to create a heightened sense of lyricism. In another recording by the Argentine guitarist Maria Luisa Anido, portamento allows for more time to be taken while not interrupting the legato phrasing of the melody. In other words, if the same kind of rubato were taken, it would sound out of context, or it would sound like a break of the line, because there's no sound in between the two notes because of the delay, the decay of the sound. But if you have a portamento, it actually continues to project the line of the guitar and creates a greater sense of the interval within the melody. This example is an arrangement of Anton Rubinstein, the famous pianist and composer of the late 19th century. His Morceau, Opus 26, number 1. Morceau is French for morsel or piece. The circled notes in the above score indicate and highlight the most prominent places where Anido connects the melody with portamento. This is a Tárrega transcription, actually, and she studied with Tárrega, so it's fascinating to think about, too. Long she held that note in there. One can hear a similarity between Anido's portamento and the portamento of Leopold Auer, that they have a common ear and were responding to a common musical style of the time. And through my own exploration on the guitar, I found that the difference in technique that the guitarists of the first half of the 20th century used, in portamento they applied greater finger pressure along all of the intermediary notes when actualizing the slide. And I'll demonstrate this. While in the common practice of today, good taste is to focus the slide on only some of the notes and apply less finger pressure so that the portamento is ultimately quieter. In other words, portamento used to be played as part of the melody, while today it's thought as an ornament to the notes of the melody. And it's important to realize that good taste might not have been forever. Good taste might be a trend of the current period or a trend of the past period, that was influenced by basically extra musical factors. Another salient example of portamento from early recordings is of the Spanish-Mexican guitarist Guillermo Gomez, and he's performing an arrangement of Massenet's Elegy, Opus 10, number 5. Gomez's fervent interpretation applies slow and gradual portamenti, sliding both in upward and downward directions, as if to imitate not a guitar, but a cello or a violin. Another expressive element that permeates early guitar recordings, as well as a piano, is displaced alignment, where two notes written to be played at the same time are actually played where the bass note precedes the melodic note. This expressive device, in addition to the rolling of chords, is present throughout the previously presented recordings. I'd like to play two historical recordings that clearly demonstrate displacement, both of Chopin's famous Nocturne Opus 9, number 2, in E-flat major. The first is the renowned pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski, circa 1928, and the second is Viennese guitarist Louise Walker, a student of the previously mentioned virtuoso and pedagogue Heinrich Albert. In both recordings, the listener can hear a striking consistency of the broken chords from beat to beat, distinct from common practice today. As well, Louise Walker couples her broken chords with an ample use of portamento, especially audible in between large melodic intervals. Overall, each performer's displacement of the bass from the melody serves to heighten the inherent affect of the nocturne, with the performer luxuriating in each beat so as to evoke a dreamlike quality of nighttime. just to demonstrate that briefly. Oh, thanks. Yeah, if there's, yeah. To demonstrate that briefly, so we've been listening to the early recordings, so now our ears are very accustomed to it. Without any displacement or rubato, it sounds like. So perhaps that's less reminiscent of this kind of nighttime dreamlike approach. Again, I'll play. But rather a kind of amalgam of Paderewski and Louise Walker with a sense of portamento, rubato. You can do something like. And so you hear this is a good example for the finger pressure thing I was talking about. Perhaps good taste today, and I can't speak on behalf of everyone, but good taste today might be something like, right, you get a little portamento to the top, right? But if you continue the finger pressure, and then apply it in context, it actually makes quite a bit of sense that this is the high point, and you're hanging on to it, right? Oh yeah, thanks.
Kevin? Kevin?
Yes.
Somewhere along the line, I got the idea that the distinction between a portamento and a glissando was kind of what you were showing there, which is that with a portamento, you kind of have slide at the beginning, slide at the end, but you don't have everything in between. But then with glisse, you have everything. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
It's all depending on what time period you're talking about. And I think that distinction, because it's sometimes really hard to trace exactly when what means what. I think that distinction came about in the 1940s, 50s, post-World War II, when composers wanted a difference between glissandi and then the actual evolution of the portamenti, which was less glissandi.
Right.
So to our ears, these all sound like glissandi, but to them it was just a portamento. That's what I think. So for the final segment of the presentation, I'd like to feature composer guitarists. And here's the Chopin, another Kade transcription. I'd like to feature composer guitarists. It's fascinating to hear how they themselves played their repertoire. The first guitarist I'll feature is Augustin Barrios Mangoré. In addition to his extensive performances throughout Central and South America and Europe, he also recorded prolifically. One notable example is the composer's own recording of the Andante Religioso from La Catedral. The listener hears a slower and steadier tempo than one is used to by current practices. Here's an example of an early recording that does not employ tempo rubato to a significant degree. You'll still hear consistently rolled chords, portamento, as well as an intense and narrow vibrato, which can be heard in violinists and cellists of the era. Perhaps this steady and slow pulse is meant to evoke the solemn affect and the solemnity of prayer, hence the Andante Religioso. Villalobos, too, was a fantastic guitarist as well as a pianist and clarinetist even, and of course a very famous composer, not only of guitar works but also mostly famous in his time for orchestral, choral, and operatic works. He was particularly known for incorporating Brazilian folk styles into his music, and you can hear this influence in the way that he plays it, not only in terms of the compositional style, but in terms of the performance practice. You can hear the different expressive devices that I spoke about: tempo fluctuation, portamento, rolled chords. And it's particular to note that there are several indications here of rallentando and orgando, but listen to how he treats them. They're not treated as kind of linear slowdowns or linear speedups, but rather it's a general gesture, and within that he can linger on an individual note or speed up a certain grouping of notes. Returning to the Spanish guitarist-composer Miguel Llobet, the listener can hear a culmination of performance practices heard on early guitar recordings, demonstrating how individual expressive elements combine to form the fabric of a musical interpretation. In his recording of his composition El Maître, based on a Catalan folk song, Llobet gives the 3/8 meter a subtle, dance-like swing, slowing down selected parts of the melody for an emphatic and declamatory effect. On the repeat of the first section, Pujol then alters his phrasing by lingering on many of the third beats, so different treatment on the repeat, and he lingers on these beats, adding a sense of spontaneity and contemplative nuance to the melody. So I hope that these recordings have offered you new perspectives on the way music can be played, especially for the repertoire of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, since we have recordings from this era. In essence, these audio treatises provide expressive guidelines that go beyond just the notes and the rhythms and even the basic expressive markings on a page. The recordings show how guitarists integrated expression with the musical structures, which is very important. And they did this through sensitive and often, by our standards, dramatic gradations of elements, such as tempo rubato, rhythmic alterations, and portamento. It's ultimately in the gradations of the use of these expressive elements that artistry is created, and that their specific artistry is created. In other words, a cut and paste approach to these expressive devices may be helpful really only as a first step. It wouldn't be the end goal of a musician exploring these possibilities. Rather, I put forward that as guitarists today, we can understand how these elements relate to the organic structures of the music, such as the phrase structure, harmony, and voice leading, to name a few. Through the inner ear and exploration and playing, we can make these connections between expressive devices and music, and develop a wider range of expression that relates to these styles of the composition's time period. Above all, these recordings give us a window into these past cultures that really shaped our beloved composers, and this is so at the heart of the classical guitar's repertoire. These recordings, they just scratch the surface of the many performances of guitarists of the early 20th century, and what they offer most of all are possibilities for us to continue exploring and expressing the guitar's incredible repertoire. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you again. I know that normally you like to do an extensive Q&A, but could maybe that happen after everybody comes on?
Can I throw in one fun fact, Michael?
Please do.
Since you started off by talking about coming here with Albert, Julio on, or Youngeren, was Albert Blaine's teacher.
Really?
Yes.
And Julio Kroll was part of that whole hangout down at Spain restaurant on Thursday.
Which amazingly is still there.
Yes, and it's the same chairs and the same waiters.
It's the same shape.
Good. Thank you again so much.